in boxing usually start from a safe spot, which we call the tonic distance. Then you move into the more risky subdominant or dominant distances to throw your combinations. After that, you pull back to the safety of the tonic distance again. We're going to call this whole process of moving in and out tactics. In music theory, there's a thing called a cadence. It's like a usual set of chords that either finishes up or takes a little break in a piece of music. Using cadences kind of gives you a feeling like the music is wrapping up or just taking a pause. Since a cadence is the smallest unit that makes up a chord progression, you can think of it as a kind of grammar in music. And there are 3 types of this musical grammar that are pretty well known. There are 3 widely recognized types of this musical grammar: TDT, TSDT, TST. Using this idea in boxing tactics makes it easier to understand longer sequences of moves.
In boxing theory, the words cadence actually means 2 different things. One is about the grammar of boxing, kind of like the rules of how you put moves together. The other is about a combination of moves you use at the end of a tactical play to dodge whatever your opponent throws back at you. To make sure we don't mix these up, we're going to use the German spelling cadence when we're talking about the boxing grammar part.
Before we bring cadence into the boxing world, let's talk about dodging moves. My trainer always tells me to throw a punch and then quickly move. You see, once you punch, if you just stand there, you're wide open for the opponent to hit you back. So, it's really important to move right after you punch. This movement is all about avoiding the opponent's counterpunch or getting to a place where they can't hit you. Since this kind of dodge always wraps up the cadence and pretty much finishes off what we call a boxing sentence, we call it cadence or cadential combination, kind of like how they say cadence in English. And we use the letter C to show it in our notes. Cadence is really about mixing both attacking and blocking moves, and it changes depending on how far away you are from the opponent. A good example is the cadence we use at tonic distance, which we call CT for short. In this example, right after throwing a punch, the boxer quickly steps back and then does a sidestep to dodge any attack that comes right after from the opponent. Now, let's take a look at an example of cadence when you're at subdominant distance, which we call CS. After you do a combo at subdominant distance, you often don't have enough time to step back because the opponent's straight punch is probably coming at you fast. So, you gotta either move to the side or duck to dodge their comeback punch. In this case, the boxer ducks left, guessing a straight punch is coming, and then does a sidestep with a weave to dodge any hooks that might follow. Next up, I'm going to show you what cadence looks like when you're at dominant distance. When you're really close to your opponent, backing off just makes it easier for them to hit you back. A better move is to push in even closer, then do a pivot to get to their side. This way, you're out of their reach. Like we talked about in boxing tactics, there's always this thing called a cadence, which is like a dodging move that wraps up each set of tactics. Plus, the way you dodge changes depending on how close or far you are from the opponent. Since we know that there's always a cadence at the end of every tactical move in boxing, which is a key part of boxing, we're going to use the idea of cadence from music theory and tweak it to fit boxing. TDT, TDC, TSDT, TSDC, TST, TSC. In a real fight, the early parts usually have you doing attacks and blocks while you're at tonic distance. So, it makes sense to think about cadence that you can do just with moves at that distance. That's why we're going to add another kind of cadence. Once we line them all up based on how far apart you are, we can sum up the whole idea of cadence in boxing like this. This K1 Kadenz shown here, which you usually see in the early part of a match, is all about the opponent throwing a combo that starts with a jab at tonic distance. Right after that, they quickly get back to keeping their distance. The one shown here is a K2 Kadenz. It starts at tonic distance, then moves to subdominant distance and gets you out of the opponent's reach. This works well when you can sort of predict what the opponent's going to do next. The thing we're looking at here is a set of moves where you quickly go from tonic distance to dominant distance and then get out of your opponent's space. This kind of Kadenz happens when both you and your opponent move forward, either to attack an opponent who's coming at you or to set up a counter. In this situation, you start off with a combo at tonic distance, move up to subdominant distance, and then push on to dominant distance to keep the attack going. This kind of thing usually happens when your opponent gets thrown off by a combo you did at subdominant distance. Thinking of all these moves just as combinations can make them too long and complicated to remember and use. Trying to memorize all these detailed patterns usually doesn't help much, because in a real fight, you hardly ever get the chance to use them exactly as you practiced. The distance between you and your opponent in a fight keeps changing because both of you have different plans. Your opponent might dodge your attacks or move into counterattack. So, it's just not possible to control the distance perfectly all the time. In music, cadenzas are made up of sequences of chords. In boxing, it's kinda similar. A cadenz is a bunch of different combinations put together. If you think of these big movements as a cadence instead of just set combinations, it's easier to break them down and look at them as groups of moves that work best at certain distances. Let's take K4 from the examples we just talked about as our starting point, and then we can dive into the analysis from there. So, in this situation, we're going to call a bunch of moves done at tonic distance a tonic combination. When they're at subdominant distance, we'll call them subdominant combination. And for moves at dominant distance, we'll refer to them as dominant combination.
By having different symbols for combos at each distance, we can really zoom in on specific parts of the cadence. Like, if we're looking at a cadence that goes TSC and we just want to focus on the first tonic combo part, we can spell it out clearly like this.
By switching out combos, we can explore what changes might come from just one cadence. Take the K4 tactic we talked about before. We can try things out by swapping the first tonic combo with a different tonic combo to see what happens. So, after making those changes, the tactical cadenz would end up looking something like this. The cadenzas we've talked about can be used as part of your shadowboxing routine. Shadowboxing is great for a bunch of things, like warming up, checking your form, and getting a feel for real fighting. But here, let's think about using it to get better at tactical moves. Like, if your plan is to keep away from your opponent, you could get a few Type 1 cadenzas down that move from T to C. Or, if you see a good moment, you could try out a Type 2 cadence that brings you closer for a heavy hit. When you're training at the gym, maybe you could work on one cadence each round. Like we talked about in separate moves and tactics, if you want to make sure you remember the exact cadences you plan to work on, it's a good idea to jot them down in a note before you head out to the gym for your workout. When you're coming up with a boxing tactic, the main things you need to think about are 1. Picking the right cadence, and 2. Figuring out the specific combos that make up that cadence. So, if you want to fight from a bit of a distance, using K1 a lot is probably your best bet. But if you're into fighting up close, then you'll want to go with K3. Every now and then, you might also want to think about different cadence sequences that aren't just the usual ones we've talked about. This cadenz here is all about a tactic where you get in close to your opponent and to make sure you don't miss a good opportunity to really get a hit in.